There's a famous line of thinking which says that if you keep doing the same thing, you can't expect different results. Now, the reason why I mention that is because there's a school of thought which, now don't shoot the messenger, says that B2B marketing has become rather samey, or to use proper English, homogeneous. Nevertheless, if indeed everyone is taking a similar approach to marketing and B2B campaign creation, then achieving separation of any degree is going to be tough to say the least. So, identifying the problem is one thing, but as soon as you do, you need to find a solution. And without giving the game away entirely, that's going to be for my guest to explain, but Don Draper really would have the answer, as well as a fine selection of drinks to discuss it over. Hello, good afternoon. My name's James Rostance, and this is the 414 live and exclusive to LinkedIn Live this Thursday afternoon today. And as I said at the top of the show, it's going to be today about what Don Draper really could bring to B2B. Now, if you've not joined us before, this is the 414 Live. It's exclusively for you if you are a professional B2B marketer, whether you are in-house at a company or agency side. And each and every week, I speak with some of the greatest and most interesting minds in B2B marketing so that you can directly expand and enhance your professional knowledge with each and every episode. And this week is going to be no different. And in fact, this week is going to be rather a special one because joining me live from Oxford Street in London, please welcome Mr. Richard Parsons.
Thank you, James. Really appreciate the invitation.
Hey. Thank you for coming along and joining me. So, yes, it's a curious title, and actually, I guess it came off the back of our discussion the other day, and I thought, you know what, reference everything that we spoke about to Don Draper would be perfect. So, with that said, could you start by explaining in your own words what you think the problem is with B2B marketing right now?
Yeah, sure. I think if Don Draper were to come back and see B2B marketing as it is now, he wouldn't recognise it. And of course, everyone talks about the massive change that you see in B2B. But to my mind, there are some things that should have stayed the same, and we shouldn't have thrown out the baby with the bathwater. And they're the things that Don Draper can definitely help with. But the things that I think that we are suffering from is that there is a focus too much on sales activation, on short-termism and sales activation. So we're always looking for running a campaign, and then what's the ROI of that campaign? And then the other thing I think that we're doing is that we're over-relying on technology to do all the heavy lifting for us. And we've forgotten some of those rules and some of those lessons that Don Draper intuitively knew.
So what would you say then are the underlying reasons then that B2B marketing has gone down this path?
I think there are two things. I think that the short-termism comes from the street, so I think that the stock exchanges and the quarterly driven reporting is part of that. But even for private companies that don't have to publish their numbers so frequently, there's still a short-termism, there's still a kind of a sales orientation with those types of companies, and certainly most B2B brands are doing that. But I think from the agency point of view, there's a historical problem, quite frankly. If I go back kind of 30 years when I first started in B2B marketing, I used to work for Anderson & Lemke, which at the time was the world's largest B2B agency. And one of their clients was a small B2B brand that was not so famous at the time, called Microsoft. And even then, the overall size of that account was 360 million in billing for the agency. So you can see, considerable stuff. But those agencies, Anderson & Lemke and some of the others, they were advertising agencies. And what I mean by that is that they had strong insight departments, had strong planning departments and strong creative departments. And once the idea was cracked, it would then go into the studio. There were as well, at the same time, kind of sister agencies, if you like, that were more doing trade marketing. And actually, the lion's share of their billings would have been for brochureware. But what really happened is when the internet came along, agencies didn't know where to put the internet. So they put it into the studio. They put it in with the designers. And that bypassed the insight phase, and it bypassed the creative expression, the articulation phase, and it went straight into kind of an executional phase. And of course, with the growth of the internet, it meant that that department, the studio, ended up with all the power. And most agencies, I think, and clients as well, are focusing too much on the execution and not enough on the upfront idea. So this combination of short-termism and this kind of historical direct marketing-driven approach and a studio-driven approach. When I say direct marketing, I mean kind of like those below-line agencies from the brochureware world. That world has kind of started to dominate, and that's really the main cause, I think, of why we've ended up where we are.
And that, I would imagine, is where the Don Draper reference comes in, because you would never find him in front of, I was going to say Mac, but they hadn't been invented then, right? But in front of a drawing board creating the campaign. It's the ideas that's missing. Is that about right?
Yeah, it's completely. It's the idea, and it's the what Don Draper, the reason why Don Draper can bring something to B2B is that he was fundamentally about humans. He wanted to understand the emotional connection with the human, between the human and the brand, and he wanted to bring that to the fore. And that's where, when the planning function or the insights function, that's what it's trying to unearth. It's trying to unearth that nugget, that little piece of gold that we can turn, that little piece of insight that we can put into the creative process, and then creatively or expressively articulate a proposition to that insight. And he intuitively knew that. And I think that, as time's gone by, we've divested in that space. And that means that we are just looking at prettifying things, making things pretty, beautifying. So you end up with designers coming up with the idea, as it were. And what I would say is the idea is very rational. The headline's very rational. The visual is often a stock image, and it's driving through to, let's say, a white paper, a thought leadership piece. So all of it's very rational, and none of it is really kind of looking at an emotional connection with the audience. With you.
Now, I should ask, in that case, what would be an example of a campaign where that's happened? I think you just touched on it then. But yeah, could you give some solid examples of campaigns where that approach hasn't been taken?
Well, you can look at, I would say 99% of B2B marketing is, even though we talk a good talk, and even though B2B marketers talk that we all should have emotional connections, it's quite often that when people talk about emotion in B2B, that they end up replacing the product shot, because they realize that's quite rational, and they put a human being in the ad, or they put a human being in the banner in the masthead of the email. And they think, oh, we tick a box, we've done the human, or we've done the emotional piece. The whole point of making an emotional connection is to emote, to stimulate an emotion in the audience, to get the audience to feel something. And that could be fear, that could be joy, that could be, happiness, could be all sorts of emotions, and people are missing that. And I think, in terms of the technology example, it's all of that thought leadership. I won't name brands because we all know them. It's the vast majority of B2B, but those emails, the over reliance on email, driving to a thought leadership piece, which is a white paper. We've got so much of that content. That it just becomes noise and has absolutely zero standout. And Don Draper would have understood that you need to stand out to be successful. Whereas it feels like B2B marketers are often taking comfort in crowds.
Yes, very much following the herd, I guess, in that sense. There was a good graphic that I saw, a meme actually, and I have to give a shout out to Seed to Branch for this. I was on LinkedIn going back a few weeks. It's funny how these things stay in your head. I'll put it up on screen now, but it was a graphic of creative directors then and creative directors now, and what we're looking at on screen is on the left, Mr. Draper, and on the right you've got a chap with, I don't know, it looks like a man bag around his head with a baseball hat, jeans, and a tracksuit top. So, probably spends more time in a coffee shop than, say, in a whiskey bar, that did spring my I guess creative process in when we were speaking.
Well, what I think you're seeing there is
Yeah.
that Don Draper was fundamentally a strategist, was fundamentally a humanist. I don't mean in the sort of non-religious sense, but he put humans first. Whereas the more modern definition that's kind of being visualized, I guess, with the modern version of a creative director is that people have mashed up the words innovation and creativity. And I think that broadly speaking, Silicon Valley is where we see innovation. In other words, they are constantly reinventing business models. They're disrupting with technology often. But on the creative side, my definition of that would be much more on the art side. It's more to do with an expression of a proposition. So more to do with how, you know, the expression of a brand's promise to the marketplace. So one is about you know, a promise of what you can do for someone, and another one is much more about kind of facilitating with technology. And I think as B2B marketers, we've mashed those two things together. So when we talk about doing something new, we immediately turn to technology. We immediately turn to a new channel. You know, the amount of people who say, oh, we want to do innovative marketing, and then they really mean something like a new channel like social media or you know, a new social channel or whatever that might be for them. They never ever look to the human being and realize that actually humans are evolving at a glacial pace. So to have insights into those humans and what turns humans on, you know, all the tools that Don Draper used will still be true today. You know, modern man isn't that old. You know, but advertising isn't that old. You know, 100 years old. So all the tools that we've ever learned in advertising are still relevant to today. I think the other thing is that when it comes to new channels and the kind of reliance on technology or innovation, that people always think that the new channel, the new medium, is going to replace the old. And then it's only when it settles down that people really understand that actually, you know, that radio didn't replace newspapers and TV didn't replace radio and the internet didn't replace TV, and that you know, as time settles down, we start to realize that each one of those channels, each one of those routes to market for our share of voice, they're all playing different roles. And I think that as we went through that phase of the studio and the technology and the web kind of driving everything down, in this kind of mentality, the brochureware mentality of you know, generating leads, short-term leads, and the canvas that we work on, moving from the press ad, which is what it would have been 30 years ago, to, you know, something like an email. There was like, well, actually, this new medium doesn't allow for creativity. But the good news is that I think that we're kind of turning a corner and moving into this into a new world where video and the internet is actually becoming a bit more like the old press world that it used to be for B2B.
With you. In just a second, I'd love to ask you to break down this process, just so that we're completely clear. But before I do, if you watching right now would like to put a question to Richard about this wonderful topic in hand, then please do put it in the comments section on the chat feed right now, and I will put those questions to Richard. In the meantime, back to you, Richard. So could you break down this process of going, what I would perhaps call going back to basics with campaign creation? How do we do that?
Well, going back to basics, I think that there's been an awful lot of, well, Don Draper was intuitive. You know, he intuitively connected on an emotional level. He wanted to connect the communications on an emotional level, and he believed fundamentally in advertising. But obviously, these days, we need some sort of empirical evidence. And the good news is that in the last 10 years, there's been an awful lot of evidence about what effective B2B marketing looks like. So there's the B2B Institute, which is funded by LinkedIn. They worked with Binnett and Field in the last year to look at some Binnett and Field research where they were looking at the effectiveness really of top of funnel type thinking. So they recognized that fame was more important than sales activation, that emotion was more important than rational communications, that reach metrics you know, outperformed loyalty programs. So there were a lot of things that they were bringing, and they were looking at the IPA data banks, which is all of the case studies that have been ever put forward for the IPA Effectiveness Awards. And they looked exclusively in the last 12 months at the B2B case studies. And they've provided so many different lots and lots of guiding principles that we can live by really now, but they're all focused on the very large business effects, the things that really matter. So things like sales, profitability, market share, those sorts of things that your CFO would really care about, rather than actually nearly what all of the below the line marketers have been doing, or the technologists marketers have been doing, which is focusing on engagement metrics. So there's lots of empirical evidence that says that Don Draper was right. Us as an agency, we also wanted to conduct some research in this space, and there were some observations. So in 1976, Bruce Henderson for the Boston Consulting Group, he had an observation that in very, very mature markets, 3 brands tended to dominate those markets. A little bit later on, Graham Deans in 2002, he also looked at some research, this time looking much more, rather than observation, he actually looked at 1,500 organizations. And he was interested in this thing called the consolidation curve. So he was interested in that in mature markets, you end up with 3 or 4 brands that kind of dominate that category. And he wanted to understand why. And he concluded that it was to do with the forces of consolidation, that as a brand starts to grow, it attracts investment money, its sales obviously go up, it's cash rich. So it starts to acquire other people in the supply side. And you end up with a consolidation, and you end up ultimately with 3 or 4 that dominate that market. And his observation was that number 1 has 40% market share, number 2, 30%, and number 3, 20% market share. And then all the others, potentially like another 10 vendors, they collectively will have about 10% market share. Now, we wanted to conduct some research because we were interested in bringing the human side to this. We know that there's been a lot of research on how humans buy, that we're using the limbic part of our brain, the kind of monkey brain, and we're making a hunch. But there's some rules or some observations that typically people try to de-risk the purchase by coming up with 3. So if you were to buy an observatory, a conservatory.
That's a big purchase.
Or an observatory.
Yeah.
A conservatory. Typically, your friends would say, go and get 3 quotes. And 3 feels like the magic number. It feels like you've de-risked the purchase. Our research indicated that actually people come up with, they recognize they have a problem. If they don't realize they have a problem, they do nothing. So sometimes as marketers, we have to communicate problems. But when we have communicated solutions to problems, typically they will recognize they've got a problem, they'll look for a solution, and they'll come up with 1, 2, 3 brands that they believe can solve that problem. Now, that decision is taken in the base brain, the limbic part of the brain, which has no rationality at all. It's incredibly emotionally driven. It's the fight or flight part of our brain. The outer part of our brain, the neocortex, is the bit that is evolved in more recent times that allows us as humans to communicate. So it allows us to think rationally, if you like. But what we think is happening is that the individual is coming up with 3 brands, and our research showed that if you just fast forward to who they buy from, in 90% of the time, they buy from one of those 3 brands that they could mention up front. And if you were the first brand, you got a 40% chance of winning the business. If you were the second, a 30% chance, and if you're the third, a 20% chance. So you can see that the pattern falls out there. So we actually think that mature market observation and that mature market fact now, as it's been kind of proven a few times for different categories, we think that's just really the micro decisions, all of those many micro decisions in the lifetime of that market that have taken place. And the 3 that are most prominent bubbled to the top, and they're the ones that really end up winning out in the long run. So Don Draper wouldn't know any of this stuff. He didn't have MRI scanning to be able to model the brain and how it thinks. But it's interesting that a lot of what he intuitively knew, that's what's come to pass as being kind of empirical evidence and being right.
I do like that. And I also like that we're talking as if he is indeed a real person as well. The lines have been well and truly blurred. That's really cool. You know what?
Wait a minute.
My next question
Don't
was...
say that, James. Don't say that, James. You're telling me he doesn't exist.
That's the point. Yeah, a dodgy thing to do, especially coming up to this time of year as well. No, you're right. He's real. He's all good.
Oh, good.
My next question was going to be about asking you to about the tangible benefits that marketers could expect by taking this approach, but you have really just kind of covered that there, where you've made a beautiful case.
I have, but
for them being top of mind,
but I
right?
think that being top of mind. But Bennett and Field, for example, say fame metrics outplay even awareness or acquisition or sales activation, and it's in that order. Fame is first, then it's in that order. Sales activation last in terms of the effectiveness on those long-term business effects. But fame outperforms sales activation by a factor of 3. Also, that they talk about a reach metric, so share of voice. If you have a 10% increase in share of voice, these are all B2B numbers that I'm giving you,
right.
That a 10% increase in share of voice will typically give you a 0.7% increase in share of market, or for services brands, a 1.8% increase in share of market. Now, when you think of the size of a market and 0.7% of that market, these numbers are colossal. But that's every year, and they act like a bit like compound interest, so they kind of add on top of each other. So really, you can see that if you just run these sorts of campaigns with a reach metric of just 10% above the nearest rival or the second in market, you will grow faster than them. But there's also another thing, which is about creativity. So not just outspending them, because you can do that, but if you can try and outthink them and have some sort of insight that resonates with the audience and a creative articulation of your proposition that aligns to that insight, then you can actually increase the perceived share of voice. So people will perceive your media spend to be higher. So you can do that by connecting on an emotional level. It's all about creating memorability, being around when the buyer wants to buy by being in their head. And typically, emotion at the front end of the funnel outweighs rational communication by a factor of 7. Again, that's a B2B number. So emotion and creating that memorability and fame for your brand means that you're trawling the market all the time, because when anybody is ready to be in the market, you're there front of mind. If you're relying on short-term sales activation, then all you're going to do is you're going to see sales spikes, but you don't see the accumulative effect of one campaign adding on top of the other. But if you run these things in the long run, in the long term, then actually they end up really growing. So typically you can expect to see your branded searches, your brand and your solution, you can expect to see those rise certainly over 6 months, but typically really properly over 18 months, which is why it's not a short-term solution. You have to wait that long. But let's face it, a year and a half isn't if you really see the accumulative effects of this stuff, it really is worth doing.
Could you just quickly run through those, the list of 3 elements there that you covered? Because I thought those were very, very cool and certainly worth a note. So yeah, those 3 points one more time, just as a recap.
Sure. So fame, fame outweighs awareness, acquisition, and sales activation. And compared to sales activation, it outweighs it by a factor of 3. Share of voice, so a 10% increase in share of voice over the second in market will give you an increase in your share of market by typically 0.7%. And for a service brand, it's 1.8%. And then emotion in marketing. So emotion versus rational will typically increase your effectiveness by a factor of 7. When I talk about effectiveness here, I'm always talking about those very large business effects. So profit, revenue, share of market, and price sensitivity, a reduction in price sensitivity. So all the things that really matter to a business, not an uplifting clicks or an uplifting, dwell time on a website. None of that engagement metric stuff. This is the hard business stuff. The stuff your CFO cares about.
Yes. Well, with that said, could you share some of your favorite examples, case study examples of this being put into effect?
Yeah, I mean, I said at the kind of top of the show that 99% of B2B brands aren't really doing this, and that means that there aren't that many examples, but there are a few. I would say that American Express, with their Shop Small campaign, which is it's a B2B B2C. It's connecting local consumers with local restaurants and retailers. For those of you who don't know, it started 12 years ago, something like that, in the States, from an agency called Crispin Porter Bogusky. They were working with Amex, and they brought this campaign to market when Obama was still president. It was they wanted something for small businesses that would drive traffic and drive business to them, that was on the back of Black Friday. So they called it Shop Small Saturday, and they did a great job of lobbying the US government. There was some policy changes that supported this thing. But they, broadly speaking, the way it works is that in Shop Small Saturday, it actually lasts for a whole month. That as a consumer, you go to the local restaurant, for example, and you'll get £5 off your bill. So you're rewarded financially as a consumer for going to these small businesses. But what I think the reason why I really like it is because everybody knows that if anybody who's an Amex cardholder, you'll know that you go to lots of small retailers and they never accept Amex because they always complain that the fees are too high. So actually it was becoming a B2B problem and a perception problem that Amex wasn't on the side of small businesses. But it was really, really, what's great about it, and the reason why I'm using it as a case study now is they've built on it and built on it and built on it. And every year they run this campaign. They haven't turned their backs on it. So it's one of their core B2B campaigns, and they haven't just thought of it as a 3-monthly, quarterly campaign. They've seen it. It's run over a decade, So it's really been effective in driving business for them. Sorry, go on.
Oh no, I was going to say that's really quite something. The idea that the campaigns run over 10 years. That's value for money.
Well, one of the lovely statistics that I like bringing out when people say that we should be running quarterly campaigns, or the audience has got fatigue from something. I remind them of, for those people who are my age and older, the J.R. Hartley ads for Yell. In the same way, Yell are connecting the consumer with the local business. But those ads were a single execution, and they ran for 12 years. One execution, 12 years. It's the longest running ad on British television. And it was a B2B ad.
And no doubt got a lot of people into fly fishing as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's been a while since anyone's mentioned that. But now you mentioned it. Fly fishing by J.R. Hartley.
But isn't it interesting that ad has not been on TV for well over 15 years, is my guess.
Wow.
And you can remember Fly Fishing by J.R. Hartley. That's the power. This is exactly so you've just demonstrated what we mean by memorability. One execution ran for a long time, was really, really had some great insight into the audience, was a really kind of sweet story of this old guy who, for the younger listeners who don't know who he is, he was a fictional character who had written a book on fly fishing and couldn't find his book. So he was going around all the bookshops and he was relying on the yellow pages to go and find, and eventually he finds it by using the telephone, and he finds an old copy of his book. But it's interesting that you can reference it, James. You know it, and that's the power of a good idea and memorability.
Right.
Another good example would be something like IBM or Cisco, who were running these great campaigns in the early noughties. And I go back all that time because although I don't think those brands have maintained the propositions and maintained the level of investment or in this approach, but I still think that those brands are today relying heavily, and the memorability for those brands relies heavily on the work that some B2B marketers did 20 years ago.
Actually, very much off the back of that, I think that links nicely to my next question, which is, what are the likely pitfalls or mistakes then that a marketing director or company executive might make when looking to take this approach?
I think it's we all work in environments where there's a need for sales. And I think that drive for sales, that the marketing function is subservient to the sales function, means that you end up with a drive for short-termism. I think that the financial pressures mean that there's a drive towards short-termism, and I think just that the kind of the lazy history that we have of doing that for so long means that we did it before, we'll continue to do that. I mean, you mentioned at the top of this show that that we need to change things if we want to grow. We can't keep relying on doing the same old things over and over again. So I think that the pressure to do short term is always the problem. Not often what we found is that people just don't have the budgets. And actually, Binnett and Field also suggest that you should be spending 46% of your budgets, your total marketing budgets, this is, by the way, 46% on brand building and 54% on throughout the funnel. So once someone realizes that they've got 3 brands and then they need to go, they understand which brands they want to work with, but they can't take that hunch into the organization. So the first thing they do is they do that branded search, and they find some rational reason why these brands are right for them. And then everybody else who gets added to the list, maybe another 8 vendors will get added to the list, they're always benchmarked and compared with the original 3. So I think it's that comparison that gives the 3 the edge, plus this kind of like this unconscious bias that you have towards the 3. So I think that the pressure internally to find 46% of your budget and do that is tricky. But actually, I think that we're in a little unique window now with COVID and the lack of physical events, which have always been sales driven. I think that this is an opportunity for marketing directors to land grab that budget and push it into the brand activity. And within the next 18 months, you should start to see your branded searches increase. You should start to see your solutions and your brand name increase in your Google Analytics. And that will give you the justification, I think, that this is working.
That's a great term, by the way, land grab, and highlighting that's even with all of this that's gone on this year, there are always opportunities. And by the sounds of it, that seems like a solid one.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely had people say to us, "What do I do with this budget?" I mean, obviously there are some brands there that are fighting for their life and have had those budgets pulled. I get it, and I understand why they would take a short-term kind of sales activation approach because they're fighting for their lives. But if you're if you're not fighting for your life, or you've actually got the luxury of growing in this time, then these are opportunities to invest in brand.
So let me ask you next then. So what would you say are the key elements to success to initiate campaigns of this nature?
So we've talked about memorability, fame, communicating in an emotional way and putting the human at the center of your communications rather than technology. All the technology is focusing on efficiencies rather than effectiveness. But if we're going to focus on effectiveness, then what brand needs is it needs a decent canvas. And I think that's where I kind of alluded to this earlier. I think that we're at a turning point where the web and video use and more interactive ad units and websites, interactivity on websites, social media, telling stories in a sequential way. These are all creating a bigger canvas to tell your brand story and to communicate your purpose. And by the way, your brand can be at the solution level. I think sometimes people always think that it has to be around the logo. You can be definitely thinking about the hierarchy of your communications and still thinking about memorability and fame for your solutions. So it doesn't always have to come right the way down, or it doesn't always have to say right at the top at brand. It can be kind of across the different hierarchy of messages that you need to take to market. But I think a bigger canvas, broadly speaking, if you ask creatives to come up with an idea for a masthead for an email, it's always a challenge. But if you ask them to come up with an idea for a 30-second video that you're going to use in your advertising, or you're going to use across social, then that always frees them up and allows them, it's a bigger canvas for them to express your propositions. So I think that all of these changes are pointing towards much more above the line approach, less of a direct marketer's approach, moving away from thought leadership, which just interrupts the people and gets you on the long list to be one of the 8, not one of the 3. But the video especially, is going to allow you to tell that story that's going to build memorability for your brand.
Perfect. Well, in that case, what would be the key takeaways that you would like everyone to have as a result of making this case and sharing this here today?
Well, we started with Don Draper, so we should end with Don Draper as well. One of his lines was, spend at least 50% of your time working on the headline. Now, of course, he was still thinking of a press ad or a poster, and he was looking to spend time on 50% of the copywriter's time on the headline. But I think that there's a one-to-one correlation between his observation that you put most of your effort in the headline, in the piece that's going to be at the front end of the communication, and then the rest of it for the tail end. And I think that this 46%, 54%, approximately 50-50, I think, putting more into that brand piece, and then the rest of it into the tail piece. So all of your thought leadership, all of your sales activation, you're supporting your sales teams, all of that work, that should really be about 50% of your budgets.
I think that's a beautifully concise and also excellently powerful summary right there. So really putting your work in 50%, as you say, into the how did you describe it? What was the exact terminology you used?
Well, Don Draper described it as the headline, and I'm saying it as the brand at the front end of the funnel. So that piece that's going to create the memorability. Put 50% of your effort and your budget into understanding the audience, creatively articulating your proposition, and then spending in amplification in media to get that message out there. And that's going to take 50% of your budgets easily.
Perfect. Well, hey, Richard Parsons, live from Oxford Street in London. Thank you ever so much for joining me today. This has been quite excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, if you've enjoyed watching today, then please do subscribe to the show. Web address on screen. Here you go. The 414. No, that's Richard. I've got the wrong button there. Normally, there's a button that comes on the screen, and that will say the 414.net. All right. Here we go. 414.net, and that will give you all the subscription options as well as previous episodes. That is a wonderful thing as well. Equally, each and every week then, as I said at the top of the show, I get to speak with some of the greatest and most interesting minds in B2B marketing so that you can directly expand and enhance your professional knowledge each and every week. My name's James Rostance. Well, join me here same time next week.